Hello and welcome. You're watching The Big Picture with me, Ishan Russell. Our focus today is on the carnage in Nice in France, where at least 84 people were killed and many others injured as a man driving a 19-ton lorry deliberately plowed through people celebrating France's National Day, Bastille Day. Now, this is probably one of the ghastliest attacks in recent times, and it comes at a time when news of scores of people dying in a country due to terrorism has sadly become a regular news item. This attack will not only change the political and security dynamics in France and Europe, but across the globe as well. And to discuss all this and more, I am joined by Commodore Uday, Bhaskar, Director, Society for Policy Studies, Sheetal Sharma, Assistant Professor for European Studies at JNU, Vinod Sharma, Political Editor and Senior Journalist at the Hindustan Times, and Ambassador Shiv Shankar Mukherjee. Commodore Uday, Bhaskar, I'll start with you in terms of modus operandi. To drive a truck through scores of people, I mean, this has to be one of the ghastliest terror attacks in recent times.
Well, clearly, I think the word ghastly is most appropriate because if you saw the images which were beamed this morning, I think the manner in which the driver of this truck had carried out this premeditated act of terror was, yes, ghastly and tragic. And in many ways, it is reflective of the way in which the terrorist is now able to use what you might call as the equivalent of routine platforms. Now, I want to reel back to 9/11, where for the first time we had the use of commercial aircraft, which again, before it happened, nobody had ever imagined that such an exigency could take place. And today, we are looking at the use of a large truck. In this case, it was a 19-ton vehicle, which had been laden with explosives and deliberately driven into the crowd in a particular manner so that you had the maximum number of casualties. So what you're seeing is really a certain degree of being enabled by technology,
right,
as also the audacity with which the terrorist is now able to operate and sow this kind of fear. I mean, today when you talk about France, if you look at the last year plus, this is now a society that is traumatized.
Right.
Because the vulnerability of the average citizen in France, this was reflected in a very, I would say, visible manner across social media. And I think that is going to be the deeper anxiety.
Right.
What next?
Absolutely. What next? The traumatized society, Ambassador Mukherjee, that perhaps is a very telling statement because a traumatized society could take bad decisions in that sense. And in terms of growing divides between communities in France, do you see that playing out as well?
Well, certainly. I mean, France has had this, you use the word ghastly, this absolutely horrible attack. Just now, in November, we had 130 people dead in 7 coordinated terrorist incidents. Before that, you had Charlie Hebdo. And there are, of course, then we can all sit down and analyze the reasons that are specific to France. And then there are, of course, reasons which promote terrorism globally, which are confined sometimes to countries for locally specific reasons, and sometimes they arise out of events that are happening far away. Which, you take the cauldron in the Middle East, and it has reflections all over the world, I think, including what is happening in France. I don't think we should not minimize, but I don't think we should fall into the trap of thinking that thinking of France as a traumatized society, where therefore we can address the question of terrorism by addressing the problems in France. Terrorism is today not done by people who are foaming at the mouth, dysfunctional people.
Right.
They are done by extremely sophisticated organizations who vary their modus operandi, who are supported by states or by institutions, and therefore they need to be countered at various levels. Certainly, this will have an impact on, but if you just remember, France was in a heightened state of alert since November.
Right.
They just had Europe's premier football tournament, at which time security was at, its highest. And even if they let their guard down a little after the football championship was over, obviously security was higher than normal, and yet this happened. So I expect in a pessimistic or call it cynical way that this is not going to stop.
Absolutely.
All this talk of intelligence failure that happens after each terrorist incident ignores the fact that a terrorist attack is done in a way that makes it very difficult to detect quite often.
Absolutely.
There are hundreds of attacks that are prevented by superior intelligence. But as the IRA once said about their failed attack on the entire British cabinet in which Maggie Thatcher escaped, it said they have to be lucky 1,000 times. We have to be lucky just once.
All right. Vinod Sharma, I want to get you in on this conversation because as Ambassador Mukherjee was mentioning, the problem is not just in France and about France. It has wider ramifications. And the French president, he said that he will continue to reinforce actions in Syria and Iraq. So the inference that is being drawn is because of the French action over there in those countries, the problem is happening in France. But is that really the case? The fact that the fault lines were already there, ghettoization had become a problem, and various other factors, including migration and the right-wing rise of right-wing nationalism, all these factors also combining to today's mess.
Yeah, yes. I think West Asia is one of the epicenters. Iraq is an epicenter, Syria is an epicenter. The Israeli-Palestinian conflict that is as old as the hills is an epicenter. And we have epicenters in our neighborhood. And I think it's a serious challenge. And the strategy of terrorists is to turn the state into a terror spreading institution. And that they want to make the state lose nerve and to act indiscriminately against citizens, which leads to a lot of collateral damage. And they are always wanting a lot of collateral damage to happen because that augments their sympathy base, that gives them a lot of opportunity to recruit people, create nurseries across the world. And I think that civilized societies, advanced countries like France, will have to, of course, defend their national security and their citizenry. But at the same time, and they'll have to make sure that nothing that they do, leads to more terror and sympathy for terror. France and Germany had been the funders of much of the actions that, the American-led actions that happened in West Asia, especially vis-a-vis Palestine, And and they are known, they are targeted, they are identified by these organizations which are now hyperactive. You see, the security of an institution, of an individual, is as strong, or perhaps less strong, than an attacker's resolve to get himself killed while taking out his target. And that is the biggest challenge for civilized society today. And I think that, Commodore Bhaskar just now said that a lot was being said on the social media. Social media is an effective tool to ventilate grievance, to ventilate frustration. But social media also contributes to creating a climate which is conducive for terror. And I think that, countries like us, India, especially when we have highly volatile situations in Bangladesh and Pakistan all the time, because it was, remember in 2008, it was a truck laden with explosives that rammed into Marriott Hotel in Islamabad. And there have been much of what is happening there is their own doing, but there too, innocent people are dying. And so also in Bangladesh and Afghanistan. So this part of the globe cannot be turned into a gated country or a community like the Europeans can do. And if they block themselves, if they block the people traveling from war zones into their gates, if they can block them, if they block them, then where shall they go? Finally, they may turn towards our side of the globe. And that is the biggest challenge we have to perhaps face up to. I don't know how we will do it because we have a demographic mix which is far more vulnerable to greater eventualities.
Right, Sheetal, coming to you, because the statements that have come across from the European Union leaders and from the French, for example, the head of the DGSI, the France's domestic agency, and he's saying that we're in a state of civil war. Now, in that sense, do we see this kind of a narrative play out even more, where people are constantly looking over their shoulders, suspecting each other, and in a sense, that sense of security that was conventionally there in a developed society versus an underdeveloped society, that sense has been shattered?
Ishan, there's no doubt that France has seen a series of attacks in the past couple of years, which has been, increasing in intensity, in magnitude, and the kind of modus operandi every time every attack is, being carried out. And it is again, so successful in terms of causing maximum damage to maximum number of people. Now, why only France? Because there are three reasons for it. First, since French Revolution, France has been an epitome of modernity. It carries, it is a symbol, it is an indicator of the Western values which stand for liberty, freedom, peace, humanity, and all those things. And that's the city that the world is looking to Paris particularly, and France in general is a kind of symbol of that. Second is that France still, even after end of colonialization, France is still economically and militarily interfering in the colonies it was once, it had colonized. So
Especially in Africa.
Yes, particularly Algeria, Africa, Tunisia, Lebanon, and all those Northwest African countries. So what has happened now, a large number of North Africans, they migrated to France in order to build France once again. However, when the company shut down, they were all marginalized, they were living in abject poverty, and there was a sense of resentment among these people that they contributed, and then there's nobody to look after them. At that point of time, it is very easy to fan the fire of radicalization and all those things and make them look as vulnerable. Now, what happens when these people tune into their local radios to listen to programs, they often hear, the kind of tragic stories the French have been doing in their native countries. Say Mali was bombed by the French military. So all these things add. The third reason is that France is, particularly at this point of time, going in for the next election. What we have seen, the Brexit right-wing parties somehow winning. At the same time, France National, is a kind of party which has been gaining strength and support. Now, what happens when you carry out these kind of attacks in a particular soil? What happens? Parties like French National Front and other right-wing parties, they get a boost and they mobilize people on the name of, that see, somebody else, the cultural other is attacking us.
Right.
And this becomes a very fertile ground, for these recruiters also to show them
Absolutely.
as anti-national, anti-Muslim and
Right.
Islam. So what happens, these three reasons combined together play with, each other, and the dynamics is this kind of situation.
Okay. I want to get an Ambassador Mukherjee in that, because you've raised a very important point, and somebody like Donald Trump is using this opportunity to say that I told you so, that we're already in a state of war. Now, does this mean, and I think it's a trend happening across the globe of countries becoming more and more insecure because of terrorism, because of the fear of the other, and right-wing politics really ruling the roost in a sense?
Well, that's absolutely correct. I mean, if you mentioned Brexit, the entire message on which the Brexit result pivoted was the message of immigration with the subtext of terrorism riding on the back of immigration because of the recent events in the Middle East and the refugee wave and the crisis it created in the European Union. So the rise of the right-wing parties is there for all of us to see. The Brexit vote, as I said, was all about the immigrants are taking our jobs. We have to stop immigration. We cannot stop immigration because of the EU. Therefore, we must leave the EU. And behind that was always the message of the wave of refugees coming across from Syria, from Iraq, from the Middle East, basically, which has already had the European Union into a crisis situation where the Schengen regime is basically tattered and almost dead. So exactly as Sheetal pointed out, you have this vicious circle. You have a terrorist attack. You have the resultant hardening of right-wing opinion, including the ordinary person who is now subjected to checks and friskings and searches, which he has never countenanced before, which is basically a humiliating exercise. And the population that is suspected, which is the ghettoized Islamic population, let's say in France or in some other country, is also subject to what is called racial profiling.
Right.
He is stopped at the bus stop. He is stopped in the trains. This was mentioned, I think, in the analysis post this particular attack as well. And in France, apparently, they do it even more blatantly than in some other places. So you have this vicious circle of terrorism, the strong counter-reaction, which fuels the bitterness which led to the terrorism in the first place, and so on. the answers that countries of the world have tried to find, I'm afraid, have not been successful. In some cases, they have been. In Nepal, we've had an insurgency that has been successfully mainstreamed. In India, we've done that 30 or 40 years ago in Mizoram. And then in Latin America, with the Shining Path, there are talks of talks about talks. But by and large, the attempts of the West in France, they call it assimilation. That assimilation is basically a message to the Islamic population, mostly from North Africa and the Western, West Africa, that you must become French and adopt our culture. That doesn't wash. And so you have this
vicious cycle
action and reaction, which unfortunately, I mean, for me, as I said, I'm cynical. I think we are just going to have to live with the acts of terrorism until humanity learns that xenophobia and the hatred of the other is not the answer.
I think, and I want to get on Commodore Bhaskar on that one, is the issue of terror and how the world deals with it. I mean, every terror attack becomes a country's internal problem. In India, we've had this problem for some time now. And as far as the global problem of terror is concerned, the lack of concerted action is leading to such a rise of xenophobia also and such attacks.
Well, I think, Ishan, first is, as far as the attack in France is concerned, I think it would be fair to say that it is not possible for France to deal with this alone. Even the suggestion that France can introduce various security measures that would allow them to quarantine and deal with the problem within France is a non-starter. We just have to remember the attack in Brussels and the linkage between Brussels and Paris, in terms of the movement of the terrorists, the perpetrators, and the kind of support and the weapons. So that's just one example about the need for very concerted action. And I think I want to link this up really with the current mood in many parts of Europe, both Western Europe as also in the Eastern part. You look at Poland, you look at Hungary, which is this whole movement of politics towards the right. And this deep anxiety and fear about the other, and for a variety of specific demographic reasons that we associate with Europe, the quote-unquote Muslim immigrant, whether from West Asia, from the Maghreb, has now become the equivalent of being suspect. And within France, I think the way the networks that have now emerged from Africa, from West Asia into Europe, and the entire global, I would say, financing, for instance, of arms, ammunition, and the terrorist networks, is going to make this a very complex problem, and no single country, I think, would be able to deal with this, which is why I think there is this constant plea for a consensus and for concerted action. But that's easier said than done, because as we know from our own experience, at each stage, you will have the equivalent of a political filter, whereby any kind of meaningful action, is going to reach the equivalent of a dead end. And I sort of, in a way, share Shiv Mukherjee's cynicism that we are going to see perhaps more of a similar kind of, shall we say, challenge as far as the internal security of individual countries, particularly democracies, are concerned. But at the same time, I think the state cannot present a picture of being helpless. They would have to, again, go back to the drawing board in the case of France and see, the civil war expression. I'm a little uneasy with this, because if France decides to go down a path of increasing securitization of state and society, I think that in turn would follow the pattern of the vicious cycle that one of our panelists had just mentioned. So I think this is the kind of challenge that the global community would have to try and really face with much greater objectivity than what we have seen at this point in time.
All right, Vinod Sharma, the point being that, last week there was a horrific bombing in Baghdad in which over 100 people were killed as well. Almost 200 people were killed in that. And the impact of that wasn't as much as us discussing about the Nice attack today. But in terms of the global community and its approach to terror, do you think that perhaps addressing terror across all platforms, there's nothing as good terrorists versus bad terrorists. We haven't even been able to define the term terrorism on a global stage. So all these factors coming back to bite us right now.
Well, one most unfortunate fallout from all these incidents has been that the world has tended to perceive every single Muslim as a terrorist. The reality is that the number of Muslims killed in terrorist action is perhaps as big a number as that of any other religion or faith. And I think that the United Nations, and I'm going to make a point with many of fellow panelists may not agree, that while there is a global war on terror happening, I mean, there is a United Nations Security Council resolution on a global war against terror. You see, the right-wing shift as a consequence of these terrorist incidents, most of these right-wingers are militarists, you know. They are people, they are rebel rousers. They do a lot of rebel rousing to win elections, you know. And one doesn't adduce any degree of, a lot of degree of equanimity of mind to them, or any degree of vision to resolve a problem outside the military sphere. That means it is not merely a law and order problem. It's not it doesn't, it may not be resolved through military action.
Right.
It may require a global political effort, which could also be termed as a reconciliation. Now, as of today, it is not fashionable at all to talk about they too having legitimate grievances. My fellow panelist said that in Africa, the French continue to be the exploitative colonizers that they once were. The French and the Dutch were always the exploitative colonizers. The British weren't as exploitative because they also bequeathed some institutions in return. Now, the point is that the global community, if it does not start thinking of a global reconciliation on this issue, much of what has been globally achieved by way of trade and by way of movement of people will come to a stop. It's all breaking apart.
Right.
And it's about time that there is a special session of some body like the United Nations or some other entity that can be created by countries, you know, sovereign countries across the globe, which are suffering from terror, and set up a dialogue process. Reach out to those people. Now, haven't the Americans and the Chinese, they agreed to oversee a dialogue process between Pakistan, Afghanistan, and the Taliban. Right. No, that did not come to fruition, to anybody's satisfaction. But the fact remains that military solution, tall talking, and allowing people like Donald Trump and the guy who got elected in the Philippines recently to come to power is the most self-defeating process that this globe can wish itself.
All right, interesting point to make over there. But in terms of immediate outcomes of what has happened, Sheetal, let's try to understand that. What happens to the Eurozone now? You've already had the Brexit. This kind of a situation now with this attack in Nice, does this mean that Schengen regime, as Ambassador Mukherjee was saying, would be in tatters? That free movement that had become the hallmark of Europe for the past 2 decades, that would be curtailed? And what are the immediate implications of the European Union?
Ishan, the state of emergency was about to be lifted on 26th of July, as it was declared yesterday, However, it has been now extended for 3 months, in the wake of these recent attacks. Now, the issue is certainly the Schengen is under attack, because whenever there's a state of emergency, the state assumes extraordinary power, in order to control the borders, check who is coming, and more frisking, more checking, of people, passport, documents, who is coming inside, outside. There will be more military on the roads, police personnel deployed. Now, what will happen as such, since this refugee crisis was, at its peak and still going on, there were, some voices from the Eastern European countries, those who were trying to border themselves, off the other Schengen countries. Now, when this state of emergency was continuing for last 3 months, and it would continue for another 3 months, now it is almost half a year. And what would happen is, people were not very comfortable with the queues which are there at the airport, or, suddenly you stop somebody in the metro or in trains and all these things. So there was a sense of kind of people were fed up with it. Please spare us with all this. But now, the latest styles, you don't need extra training in order to carry out an attack. Now, this kind of attack, you just need a vehicle to drive in and kill as many people as possible.
You need a lot of motivation.
This is a lone wolf kind of strategy that these people are applying now. So what has happened, this would continue to put a kind of psychological pressure, and seeing so many people on the street being, surveillance and all these things, it's a kind of, again, a vicious circle that generates anxiety among minds of people. So the moment you see somebody wearing niqab, it is a kind of, oh, the other, because of them we
The
are
fear of
facing
the other.
the fear of the other,
I think,
it gets aggravated, it's adding fuel to the fire, which is already, and as I know Sharma ji said, the kind of reconciliation, the dialogue which we can imagine that can bring an end to all these things, which we cannot see it coming to any kind of conclusion.
Yeah, and that conclusion perhaps could come from, Commodore Bhaskar, very closing comments from you first, and then Ambassador Mukherjee, could come from the fact that in the UK, you recently had Tony Blair being talked about as leading the country into an unfair war in Iraq, holding people accountable for actions in the recent past, especially Western leaders, especially Western powers. Could that be a solution? Could that be a confidence-building measure?
Well, I think definitely some kind of mea culpa about the origins and the genesis of the kind of unrest that we are seeing now has to be addressed. I used the word objective earlier. I think there is a case that when we are trying to get some kind of consensus on the scourge of terrorism, particularly what is now being described as the jihadi variant, there is a case for having the equivalent of a global consensus about where do we begin. And I think mea culpa and 2003 is a starting point. If the UK report is followed by something within the United States, we may have something to go by. But I'm very skeptical, Ishan, particularly if we have President Trump in the making in January, then frankly, all bets are off.
All right, Ambassador Mukherjee, final word to you. The globe needs a strong policy to deal with terror, and one that is not just about force, that's about reconciliation, about building bridges. But as we're talking, half an hour we've talked about this, and we're certainly not headed in that direction.
Yes, the world needs a concerted, coordinated global approach, including various aspects, including what Vinod was mentioning, to tackle terrorism. The globe is not going to get it, I'm telling you. Let me very briefly point out why. Number one, on the dynamics
I just have
of
a minute, sorry.
30 seconds, yes, that's enough. The rise of the right wing is a reality, and exactly as Vinod was pointing out, they are the equivalent of the terrorists in terms of the viciousness of their rhetoric. They may not use guns, but they provide the fertile ground for terrorism to thrive in their own way. And the right wing getting stronger is bad news for everybody on this planet that wants to see a stop to terrorism, number one. So you have that, which is another reason why terrorism is on the rise and not on the wane. Number two, I call a takeover from what Uday said about the international cooperation. It is not going to happen because of what I call international hypocrisy. There is still no definition of terrorism, of course, but even beyond that, there is still no agreement on an international convention to fight terrorism, which we've tabled in the UN for decades. And the reason is that there are the idea of the nation state is to pursue national interest, which is quite correct. But in doing so, America, for instance, regardless of their rhetoric and their tears when terrorist attacks happen in India, is not going to abandon Pakistan and is going to continue to give it billions of dollars of aid. The reports on Dhaka and on India on terrorist attacks always mention the word gunmen. They never mention the word terrorist. The word terrorist is mentioned only when it happens and white people get killed in France or Belgium or Britain. Okay. Now, these are all examples of international hypocrisy.
Has to end.
And cooperation is not happening.
All right, so that's not happening. We certainly we now know what needs to happen. Let's say whether the global leaders can...
always had right-wingers in power. Has West Asia been resolved? Has Palestinian issue been resolved? And you turned your back. When the headquarters of Yasser Arafat was bombed, it was an attempt to take him out.
All right, so
I mean the way they bombed Iraq, they wanted to end an entire civilization.
All right, so history is replete with examples of mistakes.
So somebody has to put a stop to it.
Yes, and perhaps addressing those mistakes.
I'm sorry, everything can happen. You just apply the results.
The starting point could be addressing those mistakes. We've absolutely run out of time. Thank you, all of you, for coming in. And that's all that we have in the big picture for today. Let's see whether the global action does happen on terror. But indeed, a sad, sad day today in France. Thanks so much for watching.